I see the
Oh,
Fall-1 reports.
okay, good. I'm looking around like I don't have any indication of what. Thank you, Kyron.
Yep.
All right, so let's talk about the reports. And again, the reports are actually the actual product of the submission. The aggregate reports in particular are what provides counts or estimates, to the state and the federal level. Um, the supporting reports will help you reconcile those counts. But all the certification errors, all the warnings you get along the way are just to help you improve the accuracy of the data uh, reported through, the data that you're submitting, and then it's actually going to be featured on the reports. They're just mechanisms to help ensure that anything, even the anomalies, we want to make sure the data is accurate as possible, and they're really tools for you. But we do all this to generate these reports, right? And so Kyron always goes through and creates these slides in there. I find it beneficial when talking about it, but it helps you visualize how you may use these reports. So the light colored green are are the aggregate reports. When I say the product or the result of the submission, the counts are featured on these reports. These are all the ones that you're going to have to certify that he demonstrated. And then those additional supporting reports are this orange red color. The arrow shows you in the direction the uh, data is linked. It also shows you the direction in which the data can be viewed and reconciled. So if you're looking at the first one, report 1.1, enrollment primary status by subgroup, that report will have a link to the student list. You'll click it and look at the student list. And depending on how you manipulate the filters of the reports, you can narrow down each report. In case of 1.1, you can narrow it down by school and look at the list of students by school, perhaps a grade level, and just with a fine tooth comb, make sure that the data reported is accurate. And then on the second page of this, you can see that there's so many additional supporting reports. You want to become very familiar with those, right? And then in purple, the most extensive student report is a student profile list. There's three different versions of it. There's 8.1 for enrolled students, 8.1A for students that have exited, and then 8.1B, those students who have been identified as dropouts, okay? And then on the right, county offices and only those of you with COE accounts have access to the 1.119 and the 1.20, and that's your version of the LCFF report or the subgroup free reduced price meal EL eligibility report 1.17 and 1.18. So the 1.119 that's available to counties simulates report 1.17 and 1.18. So if you're going to be certifying, you want to make sure, or if you are providing reports to subject matter experts or stakeholders, you want to make sure that you give them the appropriate levels of access, right? So they would need the Fall-1 reports role. If you're a SELPA, you need the SELPA reports role, and then you need access to the mapping guides. And so, if you're looking at report 1.1, primary and short-term enrollment count by subgroup, and those of you who have submitted CalPADS data for years can identify that short-term was added, right? Because we're including those enrollment status 30 students now. It's changed a little bit, and CalPADS changes every year. We mentioned it before. So this is a screenshot that comes from the CalPADS user manual, and we'll demonstrate how to use it in a moment. But that's why you see report logic, and then you see these numbers in red. Typically, when you run a report in CalPADS, you won't have what we've added in the red here. That's just to help you dissect the report. On this particular report, you can see the different columns. You have your enrollment count. Again, this is as of Census Day. So if you look at it on November 5th and students have come and gone, what you have on November 5th won't always be what's on this report, because again, we're looking back to who was enrolled with a primary or short-term enrollment on October 6th. So you have your enrollment count, how many of those students are transitional kindergartners, how many have been identified as English learners, Title III eligible immigrants in the GATE program, migrant students, students with disabilities, right? And then we have column 10. And if you missed it earlier, Kyron was talking about federal reporting socioeconomically disadvantaged students. He had a circle and then a bunch of little circles, and he talked about the data elements. And he mentioned in federal reporting, socioeconomically disadvantaged students also include students with the parent education level code of 14. Now, if I didn't know that and I had this list of students and I wanted to know what does it mean or who comprises this group of students, that's where I would go to reference documentation. And so I like to say you need a referential knowledge of what each document contains. Here's the user manual, right? Kyron authors the user manual and he doesn't even know all what's in here, right? It's like that old adage, I forgot more than you'll ever learn. Kyron's forgotten more than he's ever learned. He's put it in here, taken it out, he's mastered it and forgot it. But one thing we know, and if you just become familiar with this tool and the navigation, you'll get an idea of what you can go find, right? So if you just come to this, if you're unfamiliar with the user manual, if you just click each one of these and just kind of make a mental note of what's included, you'll see the mapping guides. They're also down here. And so the report mapping guides is the best tool for dissecting the reports and identifying what you're looking for. So you kind of have to know what type of report you're looking at. It's a certification report, so that's a snapshot report, and it's for Fall-1. So I'm a shortcut and come to this link. I'm looking at report 1.1. And so I have a description of who's included in this report at the top. If there's two different versions, this is an older legacy report, so there are two versions. There's an ODS version and a snapshot version. And then the basic selection criteria. Who can I expect to be included of this report? And so you can see that because it's a recent change, we haven't updated to include short-term students, but it says enrollment students with the as of date, that would be October 6th, where the enrollment status equals 10 primary enrollment in grades preschool, KN through 12. So we know that if I'm looking at infants and toddlers, they're not going to be on the report, right? The basic selection criteria helps me eliminate certain students by grade level. So I know if my enrollment count is off, I need to account mentally for the report not including infant and toddler grade levels. It also says for the snapshot report, must have a student information record that overlaps the enrollment. So again, if I have a CERT 004 error and I'm looking at this report, those students will not be included on this report. So that's why we always recommend resolve the errors before you actually look at the reports, because any fatal certification errors may exclude your student from your counts. And so while I may have completed my enrollment on Census Day and I just think I'm going to go look at report 1.1 to see if it's looking right, if I have a lot of CERT 004s, it's not, right? You have to complete your submission in its entirety before you move on to the next step. And so this is a reason why, and this is already showing you the value of the tool. Then at the top of each report, before you run it, there are a list of filters. The mapping guide tells you the different filters that you might want to use. So we can scroll down. And so here's that image, right? It's the same image that we used for the PowerPoint. It's the report logic, numbered each column. And so I want to find column 10 in the rules down here. And I can see that there's several different rows. So each row is a condition in which the student may be included, right? And so at the very top, you see student information field 2.50, parent guardian highest education load code 14, not a high school graduate. So if I have a student that the parents indicate in their enrollment record or in however you collect that data that they're not high school graduates, they're going to be included in socioeconomically disadvantaged. I mean, that's just because that data element has been populated. I mean, perhaps the father is Andre Agassi and he's a professional tennis player and he left high school because he was making millions at 15 years old as a tennis player. Baby Agassi is rich, has all the privilege in the world, but they're included in socioeconomically disadvantaged because of the selection criteria. And so as you're reconciling these reports, you want to become familiar with the data guide. You want to look at the different elements and have an understanding of how to use this tool. Now, let me come over here. And so I see the count. I know the students included in this count, but how do I identify those students, right? I have an understanding of the selection criteria, but I want to know. So when we talked about the reports linked on this report, you can see the school. If I click this school, I will be linked, and it will tell you on the mapping guide too where you're going to go. So if you wanted to know ahead of time, Kyron marks here in blue, so you can see that it's a link. The school name column leads to report 1.2 enrollment by subgroup. What you need to know in terms of functionality is you're going to go to this school, right? You're going to go to the student list version for the school because the link is the school name. So you're getting a smaller version or a condensed version of the report, a more specific report. If I were to go back to my reports menu and select 1.2, I would get a district enrollment or a LEA enrollment version of this report if you're a charter school. And you can see that this has each individual student, their SSID, demographic information, and then the subgroup criteria. Now, a student may not be in any of these buckets, but if they are enrolled with a primary or short-term enrollment, as report 1.1 reports primary and short-term enrollment, they're going to be included on 1.2. However, if they are also in a specific subgroup, they will be reported here, right? And so that is explained if you would to look at the description of report 1.2, who's included, you would find that out, all right? And so I could look at my list of students, and if they're in column 16, socioeconomically disadvantaged, and they don't meet any criteria for free or reduced lunch, foster youth, migrant, homeless, or foster youth, I would know then to look at the student information record and then look at the student's parent ed level. And if I question it, I would verify that in my SIS, what was reported, what should be reported, and that would be how I might use that report to resolve discrepant data. So another version of this, a supporting report for 1.1, is your enrollment count, is the enrollment status disaggregated, right? And so you can see that you have your schools listed again, and then you have whether or not they identified as having Hispanic ethnicity. Well, you have your total enrollment here for each school. Then the second column to the right of that is whether if they identified or what percentage of students identified as having Hispanic ethnicity, and then your different race codes, right? What students identified as Filipino, or were termed Asian, 2 different buckets. Ask Kyron about that, not me. African American, Pacific Islander or Hawaiian, white students, and then multiple, right? And again, this is, I believe it's a federal report. It's supporting 1.1. So you have your different columns that coincide with the way it's reported federally. And then multiple means the student may be in Black, white, or Black, white, and Filipino, or all of the above, right? Filipino, different, maybe Chinese, Black, white, and Hawaiian, because you can have up to 5. So parents can identify with all their nationalities or race codes, whatever. That would fall into the multiple. And then missing are all those parents that did not want to identify. They didn't want to identify their ethnicity. They didn't want to identify their race. That's what the missing is here. Something unique about the report that Martha kind of pointed out to the training staff was this report can give you a district level indication by these filters. And so typically you want to click these filters in the columns, but the way this report works is you want to use the plus sign If you look at the school code on the left, there's a plus sign. And if you were to click it, it would expand. And so we kind of try to simulate that. We just overlay the screenshot. It's not real functionality, but you can see that if we expand at ABC Unified, it opens up and it goes down. Now there's something that I want to kind of highlight is if you can see the school name, if it's large enough, you can see I have high schools and middle schools. I use the report filters just to select by school type, high schools and middle schools. And so when I was creating this slide, I noticed that there's a grade 3 here, right? And so this is a good way to use a report. We left it here because this would identify to me discrepant data. I didn't see it in report 1.1. I didn't even see it in report 1.2, but by looking at the supplemental report 1.5, I can see that I have a student at a middle school or high school in grade level 3. We know that's incorrect. I know that's not right. So I'd want to filter this report and find out which school that student is located at, then identify which student it is, and then go look at their enrollment record in CalPADS, because I know that that grade level is incorrect if they're enrolled at a high school or middle school. And it seems ridiculous, right, if you're sitting there listening, but I do know through practice that CalPADS sends you a warning when you enroll a student at a grade level that the school doesn't support. It doesn't give you a fatal error, it gives you a warning. And so because there's situations in which you might have a elementary school student taking math or some, have a secondary enrollment that doesn't show on the report at a middle school. Some students are advanced, or some students have to go to a different school for a special program that doesn't traditionally support their grade level. So this didn't trigger a fatal error, and this discrepant data is on the report. And this is why the submission process is iterative, because to correct this, I would either have to go to online maintenance or correct the record in my student information system and submit a file. Either way, you do have to correct this in your student information system, because this data would have come from your student information system. So then, the next report is report 1.17, FRPM. And again, we're not going through every report, it's just the aggregate reports. And we use 1.1 to show you how to reconcile using supplemental reports. But report 1.1, the FRPM English Learner Foster Youth Count. Again, we like to call it, or I do, and LEAs do as well, inappropriately, or we call it the LCFF report. It's not exactly that, but it can be used to help you identify which students are eligible for LCFF funding. And so if you're there, Martha, if you want to talk about the 2 columns that were added, or the additional column.
Yeah, I'm here. So there's some defaults on the filters when you come to the 117, and one of them is age eligibility. And in past years, when you use that filter, the enrollment would be based on that age eligibility that you had in there. So it was a reduced amount. And so the department had some program areas that wanted to be sure that regardless of what filter you use, for, age-wise or enrollment, that we would give you your total enrollment regardless of the filter. And so one column, the first one, is what you're used to always seeing, that based on whatever filter you use, it's the enrollment for that filter. The second column represents your total enrollment regardless of the filter that you use. That's the easy way to explain it.
Thank you, Martha. So beyond these 2 new columns, which I don't have a full grasp of the effectiveness of, but Martha thankfully joined us today. The important thing to point out with this report, and as you reconcile counts, is that it's unduplicated. You can see that it's listed here and there. And what does unduplicated mean? So if you're new to CalPADS, it just means that the student in this count is counted 1 time. You'll never have a student represented more than once in this row, unduplicated, eligible, free and reduced price meal counts. Again, the total unduplicated FRPM EL eligible count, the last column here, again, those students will only be counted once, right? And so we say that because you have your different categories of students or subgroups, I should say, in which a student may be eligible for LCFF funding, right? You have your free and reduced price meal. Those are only students that you submitted a 181 and 182 record for. And so we know your entire student body may be receiving free and reduced lunch or free lunch, right? We know they may be receiving free lunch, but not all of them are income eligible, either through an alternative form or through the traditional NSLP application. If they have been identified through one of those two methods, they would have a 181 or 182 record. If you have any foster youth students identified by a CalPADS match, they're included here. This is not data that we necessarily submitted. They were identified. Although you can do a manual match, Department of Health and Human Services provides us with a file, a list of foster youth students enrolled in California, and their demographic information is used to match those students. And so those are the students represented in the foster youth column. So they're eligible in practicality for free and reduced price meal just by being foster, but also they're identified as eligible for LCFF here on this report. Now, it is your LEA's responsibility to identify tribal foster youth. So if you're in a community that has tribal organizations or tribal communities, you want to work with the leaders in those communities. There's a link to the foster youth guidance by the CDE, but it is your obligation, it is your duty to identify tribal foster youth. This is not a match. These students will not show up if they do not have a program record 193. Then you have your homeless students. Again, this is reported by program 191. It has to be verified yearly. So if a student was homeless last year, if their displacement continues, the record doesn't have to be closed and opened anew. However, it is your obligation to verify it. That student will be counted as long as there's an open program record for 191. So any students that are no longer homeless, you want to make sure you exit that program. Then program 135 is your migrant student program. They are reported by program 135. In the student programs, self-paced, Kyron talks about migrant students, how they're identified, through what channels. For the terms of this report, the migrant program is a 3-year program. Any student that has a program that's open longer than 3 years will trigger an error and will not be included on the report. Although their eligibility may continue beyond 3 years, the practice, which is described in the CalPADS FAQ and in the data guide, tells you that you need to start a new program for that 3-year period when their eligibility is extended. And so if you're reconciling your migrant counts and students eligible for LCFF, you want to make sure that this subgroup of students have been reported appropriately. And then direct certification, these students' demographic records are matched again to another file from Department of Health and Human Services. They can be direct certified for several different categories. There's a version of this, I believe, on YouTube or perhaps in Bridge. Not sure, Marshall may have added that. It was a CDE kind of webinar. The key here is every student that might be in one of these groups, right? Perhaps foster youth or tribal, you might expect them to be directly certified and they may not show up, but it's okay because they're categorically eligible for free and reduced price meals because they might be foster, tribal, foster, homeless, or migrant, but also they're only going to be counted once. Okay, so there was a question earlier, if I have a foster youth student that was identified and matched, but not also identified in direct certification, what efforts do I need to make? You technically don't have to make any effort because they were identified as foster in that scenario. And so then you have your duplicated count again to revisit it. You cannot go left to right and add up this number because the student may be in multiple buckets and only count it once here. And then, as we know for LCFF, it's not just those students that are typically in disadvantaged subgroups. Also our EL students, historically, they need a little bit more support. And so they're included as well. And so your EL funding eligible students are identified. And again, a student may be an English learner and a migrant student, or an English learner and a tribal foster youth, or English learner and directly certified. They're only going to be counted once in this final column, regardless if they qualify for multiple buckets, right? And so, since it's an unduplicated report, a student can be represented in more than one column, but end up only once on your final numbers. How do you reconcile that report? Again, that's where you come to your supporting report 1.18. And you can see you have your student information, demographic, and enrollment, but then you can see the reason why they may be included on that report. And 1.18 is only going to list those students eligible for LCFF. And either they were direct certified, yes or no, foster youth, yes or no, homeless, yes or no. If they are eligible or do have a program record for free, the National School Lunch Program, it's going to be 181 free or 182 reduced. That will show up here. If they're migrant ed, that will show up, and what their EL status is, right? And so student, again, may have multiple Ys and a program record, but they're only going to be counted once. And then new this year is report 1.24, dropouts by subgroup. It's kind of to replace the reports that were lost last year as the calculations changed. We moved to graduates, and at a time the completers and non-completers reports were discontinued. So we just wanted to provide, since the dropouts are still in fall, a dropout report so that you can look at and identify your dropouts. Again, this is an LEA level dropout report. So these are the ones that you are reporting. These are the students that you are identifying as dropouts through your exit reason and exit status code. If you're questioning student exits, please look at the student enrollment self-pace. We talk about enrollments and exit. And this report links to an updated report 1.8. This is a screenshot taken from the specs. This report is coming. And so it'll be viewed for the first time when you look at your snapshot reports for Fall-1. Also new is the California is the county authorizing version of this report. That's the C/A. And so if you have a COE account, if you represent a county Department of Education, you're going to have a version of this report. Or if you're an LEA and you have the authorizing role because you have independently reporting charters authorized by your LEA, you can see the results of those charters through this report, the CA version of report. And then report 2.1, Title III eligible immigrants. Kyron talked about the criteria that identifies the student as an eligible immigrant. And this is a very simple report. How many of your students at which school is an eligible immigrant? I will say, if you're trying to look at the counts on this report and they look wrong, incorrect, most often it's your indicator. There's an indicator of if the student's been enrolled less than 3 cumulative years, and that requires a yes indication if you're submitting a file, or you need to click the button online maintenance. So students that have been enrolled longer than 3 years should have the indicator removed from their most recent demographic record, or submit a new record to replace it and remove that indicator. And then students that have been enrolled less than 3 cumulative years, even if it's not at your district, should have that indicated as a Y value and to include this student in the eligible immigrants. Report 2.8, English language acquisition status count by primary language. You can see that all primary languages are listed here on this report. It may be an old screenshot because we are missing the Adele status, but that's what you don't see here. And then you see your FEP counts, IFEP and RFEP, right? And then you have report 2.9 English language acquisition status census day comparison. This allows you to look at those students who have progressed from EL to RFEP over last year to this year, right? You can kind of look at the different statuses and the change in status. It's also good to look at to see if your data was reported accurately. We would expect our English language acquisition status to reflect the students, and because the students come from the same community year to year, we don't expect a great variation. It should kind of be consistent. Although there should be some variation, it shouldn't be tremendous, right? We wouldn't expect, unless there was a cataclysmic event, to go from 1,000 English learners one year to 5 the next, right? And so the comparison report is still a good tool to make sure your data is accurately reported. Also, it goes by school. So if the EL counts are not adding up to the way you would expect, you can revisit that before you go to certify. Then you have your report 8.1. We talked about there's 3 different versions. There's an active enrollment. There's a student exit report version of this. And then there's a dropout. I think C 8.1C is a dropout list of students, but it provides you the great details. And if you were looking at your dropouts and you were trying to identify trends in those students who are dropping out, this might be a good report for you, because you might find a common thing. Maybe they were homeless students, and a lot of your dropouts have a Y, right? We know the past 2 years have been hard on some families. And so maybe their situation, their living situation impacted their ability to graduate or focus on graduation. Perhaps you identify that more of if you're looking at 8.1C, special education students are fitting that bucket and they need a greater deal of attention. Or maybe it's your socioeconomically disadvantaged students. Either way, the purpose of these reports is not just to verify counts for accountability and certification. You know, you want actionable data. You want to turn the data into information and make choices for your LEA and what's best for these students. And then kind of for the last several years, we jumped to the 16 series, right? Those are the reports for students with disabilities by education plan, and primary disability count is 16.1. So it's going to list the primary disability. I think it's 14, maybe 13 primary disabilities that are identified under IDEA. And then if you look at the third column, it says 100 IEP. Whatever their plan is going to be listed, whether it's an IEP, ISP, or IFSP is going to be listed. And it's just a count of how many students in a particular special education program by primary disability. Then 16.2, again, is an aggregate report, just like 16.1. It's students with disability count by federal setting. And so you have the federal settings listed across the top, right? Starting with 103 and then 500. And then the primary disability will be listed down in each row in the third column. And then you can see the count of those students. And so this is a good report to try to identify if any students are not in the least restrictive environment, right? You can also verify that students are getting equitable services, right? If we have many students with a speech or language impairment, we would expect them to be getting similar services, right? We wouldn't expect necessarily students with the intellectual disability, they might need a different service than those with a speech impairment, right? Because it's 2 different disabilities. We want to make sure they're getting the appropriate services in an appropriate environment. So that's a good report for that. And so going along with ensuring the FAPE for all the students, you can see that there's last 3 columns, general education participation. And so this is reported by the LEA. If you're unfamiliar, it's in the special education program file. and it's identified whether the student is in 40% general education or less, if their time in general education is between 40 and 80%, or if it's 80% or more, right? And so it's a report that helps us meet federal accountability. And then to reconcile these reports, you go to the student list. It's a supporting report, and you can see there's greater detail. There's greater detail pertaining to the student's demographic. You can see that the meetings that are on the report are featured here. You only see a 40 at the top because this is an older screenshot. We can update it. The first year that this report was run, 40s were included. Do not expect to see any of those evaluations included going forward, including this year. And then you see details about their special education program. So we want to pause for a moment and talk about who should be reviewing this particular report, right? If you are the SIS data coordinator, if you're submitting enrollment records and programs and seeing ELAS statuses, but you're not familiar with your special ed system, the data collected, someone else is doing that, you probably want to make sure they have the appropriate role to review and access these reports, right? This is also when we talk about critical thinking and coalition building, you want to work with them. You don't want to turn a blind eye. You don't want to say, it's not my responsibility to report this data. This is an opportunity for you to grow and learn and to know what to expect, because a lot of the issues when it comes to resolving records for students with disabilities is the marriage between the special education program and their enrollment. A lot of it is. And once data is in CalPads, if it needs to be corrected for students with disabilities, that correction, as of right now, has to be made in a special sequence. You have to go to CalPads using online maintenance, delete the record, then submit a new one from your special education system. There is no online maintenance functionality to change record elements, and there may not be a deletion mechanism from via API. So they have to know how to log in, go to the student's record, identify the particular record, maybe using the meeting identifier and the date, delete that record, then submit it. You also want to know the relationship between a special education program record and a service, because if I delete a special education program record, all the associated services for that particular meeting should be deleted as well and then replaced. So just want to, the SIS data coordinator has to be familiar with the process and the data, just like your SEDS data coordinator. But ultimately, your special education program staff should be looking at the reports for students with disabilities. They should have ownership of those reports. And then so when we look at the services for those students, we're going to go to report 16.5. Again, it must be certified. It's an aggregate report. And you can see that it lists the primary disabilities across the top. And then you can see the service category and the student service, which is the service. If you would expand by clicking the plus here. And so we kind of simulate that there. You can see the expand that shows the different service category and those services. And then how the student or which students, with the number of students receiving the service by primary disability. And then to reconcile these counts, you would then go to report 16.6, students with disability student services. And you can see more details about the student services, including the provider, the duration, the frequency, the meeting date in which that service is associated to. And you know that because you have the meeting amendment identifier. So that's how you reconcile the services. And then you have report that's coming, 16.11, students with disabilities, annual comparison report. This will help you recognize any differences in the count by primary disability for your students with disabilities. And so, your special education staff would know more so what to look for in this report and the significance of it. When we think about what our SELPA is going to see, they're going to see all the reports that you have access to with students with disability. Except for the SELPA reports, it's more extensive because their version of the reports will go by district, by LEA, and then they will be looking, the SELPA version of the report is the exact same, but it will go by LEA. So theirs would be much more extensive than yours if they ran the SELPA version of the report. You need the SELPA reports role to see this. So if you're newly assigned to a SELPA and they say you are responsible for CalPADS, make sure you have the appropriate roles. Or if you're attending and you don't have an account, you send in a support ticket, identify what SELPA you're associated with. The CDE can create you an account and give you the appropriate roles. Then you have 16.2. Again, you have all the reports that the LEA sees. You just have a broad SELPA version of the reports. The functionality is the same. And then you'll also have a 16.11 version of the report. The SELPA reports are waiting for snapshots, right? You got to submit data. And then on October 6th, we're expecting the snapshots to be run. You can see the snapshot reports, right? And so there was a question asked, what report should I look at if I'm at a SELPA or special education and I can't see those LEAs, right? And so you go to the user manual, you go to reports, and you go to accountability monitoring reports. And these two reports down here are ODS reports. They run continuously. The one thing I want to point out is if you read the description, the students need an active special education record and a qualifying enrollment. So although we associate 16.8 and 16.7 with students that might have a late IEP meeting or haven't updated their transition goals, that's not necessarily true. Every student with the active IEP, ISP, IFSP will be listed on this report, even if they do not meet a criteria, which they're late, right? And so that's something I think you want to be aware of. These are LEA level reports. So your SELPA may ask you for an account so they can review these reports. So that's something you want to make sure you know of, okay? But the SELPA may not want to wait till October 6th to see what's going on. And these are the reports, these are the current mechanism in which they can review the data.